Hanselka.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you for a little while this morning or this afternoon now. And the topic is unintended consequences of brush manipulation. And we've got a long, long history of manipulating vegetation, brush included. And sometimes the results have been very positive, and other times negative, and of course other times neutral. But the main thing, obviously, is that you have to have some goal, you have to have some objectives, and then choose the right thing, right practice that will achieve those goals and objectives. That hasn't always been the case, and that's some of the things we want to point out. However, when we talk about history, whether it be our nation's history or a history of anything, we've got to think about the the activities that went on at that time in the context of that time. So we can look back 100 years now or 50 years and say, wonder what the heck were people thinking when they did that. But if you think about it in the context of the period in which it happened, it might have been a what they wanted it to do. On the other hand, uh, lots of these consequences that we'll be talking about have carried on to the present through time, and that and has caused us to have some major issues. And we'll talk about a lot of this as we go. It's, yeah, pardon me. We're finding operating this machinery. There we go. Um, if we look at our landscapes today, and I'm most familiar with the South Texas landscape, but whether you be in the hill country or the rolling plains or Trans-Pecos, East Texas, or wherever, um, there is a complex of vegetation that has been dictated by the soils, by the climate, and by past management practices. In South Texas, you're looking at four major sites, whether it be a deep soil in the upper right, shallow cleachy type rocky hills on the upper left, or sand in the lower right. And uh, this is the expression of what's there today. It hadn't always been this way. The upper or the lower right picture down on the sand sheet near Falfurrias uh, probably was at one time a blue stem prairie with mesquite savanna situation. So this has come in, and then things have changed over time that uh, we will either value or maybe it be undesirable, and we have to do something about it. Um, and literally, early travelers through Texas recorded their observations, and uh, in many cases, they talked about the endless prairies, punctuated from time to time with a gallery forest along a stream as you go, say, north from Corpus Christi up to towards Oklahoma or the Louisiana line. But then about 1850 to 1870, things began to change. These open prairies began to have woody type plants grow in them, and again, depending upon where in the state, different species started to predominate. Uh, Historically, as I said, it's been around a long, long time, and we can go back biblical times, even in Hebrews, they talk about and the whose end is to be burned or to grub them out in Isaiah. Um, in more recent times, 400 years ago, down around Monterrey, Mexico, Calleja quoted, well, in 1795, about the spread of Wasatch, and that the farmers and the ranchers did not take the time to grub them out, and they were becoming a real problem. Um, and then, of course, in later years, back in the 20s and 30s, in the Depression time, 1890s, Tom Lee talks about in his two novels and two books on the King Ranch, talks about itinerant workers coming in and finding employment by grubbing out large acres of mesquite. And we can find this throughout the literature of Texas. Now, the brush is here. What are we going to do about it? And why do we want to do something about it? And often it doesn't meet our goals and objectives. We may want to change species composition. If it is a juniper thicket and we want to have a little bit more deer friendly, wildlife friendly brush in there, we may want to take some of that juniper out. Community structure being the same way. If it's all overgrown, old, mature, woody plants, um, may not be accessible to animals, and thus we may want to change that architecture in some way. The distribution, too little, too much, too thick in areas, too thin in others. May want to change that around a little bit. And usually, historically, brush management has been mainly to reduce competition, to grow grass, and in more later years to grow more desirable brush or forbs for various reasons. But mainly, we think in terms of reducing the competition between the woody plants and the forage plants for livestock. Facilitate establishment. That's if you want to convert a pasture situation into a more I hate to call it improved, but say the introduction of some grass or some row type crop, uh, or even a food plot establishment. You want to remove the competition to facilitate that. Um, so basically, there are tools and methods for doing each of these. We've got good science behind it. I think what we've lacked most over time is the art of it and art of putting it together in a long-term sustainable way that meets our goals and um, continues the functioning of the system. So species composition, community structure, uh, community distribution, reducing competition, and facilitating establishment of different species. Basically, there are four major categories, as we uh, all know. Really don't know who the audience is at this point, but basically, I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with this, but we can look at from the oldest fire to some of the newest in the biological terms or chemical terms, and many tools that's available to us. They may be mechanical, chemical, biological, or of course the use of fire. And each of these have their pros and cons, and each of these have caused us some unintended consequences over time. Um, but so we'll discuss a few of these as we go. Mechanical, the oldest mechanical tool is some kind of hoe or grubbing device to dig it out. We can kill these plants in several ways, but mainly we've got to kill that bud zone down and at the base of most of our brush plants. So the capacity to resprout is um, taken away from it. So we mentioned a while ago groups of itinerant workers coming around the countryside to grub out mesquite, and that photo on the upper right here shows several such workers doing this. In many cases today, grubbing hoes do not fit in the hands of modern people. I don't know if the hands have changed or the grubbing hoe handles have changed, but we just don't see it as much as we used to. However, we do have mechanical grubbing hoes and stinger blades on the back of tractors and many different tools of that nature that accomplish the same thing. We can take it from the root plow and uh, the Running W Holt cat shown on this photo was a double motored D9 situation with a 14-foot root plow. Could cut quite a swath through the pastures and dig up by cutting the roots and trying to remove that bud zone, lifting them out of the ground. Uh, then, of course, we've got roller choppers and we've got discs and we've got sickle bars and we've got all kinds of other things. Uh, from a mechanical perspective, to mechanically take out that bud zone or change the architecture of the brush stand so that it will be more suitable for whatever we're trying to raise out there. Chemically, again, chemicals go back a long ways. We'll talk about those in a little more detail, ranging from a the old kerosene wagons and backpacks or buckets that just go around and basal treat brush, particularly mesquite, backpack sprayer in a cut stump situation, and then the applications either by air or by ground or by individual plant treatment. Biologically, we don't have as much control, therefore it's not as popular as a management tool. We think of these more in terms of, especially with goats, in using these uh, animals as a tool to produce meat at the expense of and using an unwanted resource. So in this case, it becomes a wanted resource. Again, they do well on young regrowth, tender weeds and brush. So maybe a mechanical treatment or something in conjunction with biologically controlling them with goats is something to consider. On the other hand, we've tried over time to use various insects and diseases to control unwanted pests. The cactoblastis moth, for example, for for cactus. The photos shown here is salt cedar, and that's the salt cedar weevil that they're working with out in the western part of the state. And then, of course, fire. Fire is a management tool. It's not an end all that will kill a lot of plants, but we can work with weeds and more so with brush in manipulating species replacement and so on. But we can change the architecture, and we can weaken and change the composition with fire. Okay, unintended consequences. We'll finally get to some of the meat of the topic, and again, we have to think about the use of these various methods in the context of the time that they were developed, and under the context of what the goals and objectives are and were. So advances in technology and science, of course, was and is much faster than its art. We can learn a lot about killing brush, but we don't know a lot about the art of putting it on the landscape. And so that's one of the challenges that we need to think about and maybe take home from trying to look at it from this perspective. And of course, much of the time, we're all aware of, and we're fall in this category too. Much of the time, the users want a simple cookbook approach. Brushbusters has been really successful. You don't have to think very much to use brushbusters. It's how to kill it, 3 easy ways. The application on the landscape becomes a little bit more difficult, and that's where what we're trying to look at today. So let's think in terms of over time. Early on, brush management has been essentially a tool to improve grazing, the forage quality and the forage quantity for grazing animals. And therefore, we've tended to apply it on large scale areas and try to kill it as much as we can, and then come back and treat it when we need to in order to grow grass. Uh, and this was the paradigm that we worked with and still work with in most, if not, of course not all, but most brush management situations. Then in about the 60s or so, when free hunting was going out and wildlife became more of an economic commodity, we started to think in terms of, well, maybe I need some of this brush out here. And then we started looking at, well, how much and what quantities, what proportions, and what species. And this may range from a common white-tailed deer to a very uncommon Atwater's prairie chicken. And it includes all kinds of wildlife today. Over time, it's been kind of limited to 2 or 3 major species, economic species, but we know that every species has a niche and requirements for habitat, cover, and water, and food, living space, so that we need to be cognizant of these things. We haven't always been aware of this. Today, if you look at the cost or the price of land and the evaluations of land, in many cases, the land that's got a lot of brush on it, whether it be a cedar brake or otherwise, is valued more than an open piece of land that's got a lot of good forage grass on it. So again, do you want to take off all of your brush, including that 300-year-old oak tree out there, or do you want to manipulate it in some way so that aesthetics play a role here? And then, of course, recreation is becoming more and more, whether it's hunting or whether it's just being out on the land and so on. So recreation was not a major consideration 100 years ago. And so we can look back and say, yeah, Lee, I wish we hadn't opened up that brush and those pastures like we did. But remember, the paradigm at the time was grazing, and by taking out as much as you can, as you and for as long as you can was the goal. We called it eradication, and you can still look at old journals and magazine articles talking about eradicating mesquite, eradicating brush, pre 1950, and people tried to do it. And of course, what were the unintended consequences of the eradication era? Many acres across the state of Texas was plowed fence row to fence row. And we learned pretty quick we couldn't eradicate it, and it came back in a such a way as that many times it was worse afterwards than before. So the eradication time frame, we learned pretty quick by the 50s that we weren't going to eradicate brush. So instead of calling it eradication, we started calling it control. Control is a euphemism for eradication in many people's minds. They talk about control, and it's mainly to kill as much as you can for as long as you can, but with the realization that you're going to have to come back sometime in the future. And this is from the 50s on up through perhaps through the most of the 60s and on into the 70s. And many acres of brush in Texas was controlled through not only individual incentives, but the government programs, the Great Plains program, and so forth, uh, using a variety of mechanisms, both mechanical and chemical. This was the heyday of many of the herbicides and the heavy equipment being developed. Now this is a busy chart. It's just to indicate time and kind of the era involved and the amounts of acreage is treated by any one way. And so you can see that the chain between two bulldozers, the anchor chain being gathered or being chopped, was fairly popular, and lots of acreage was done this way. But then about between the 50s and 60s, the root plow was developed, and many acres was root plowed. Some of the unintended consequences would be that as you plow it, what are you going to do with all that detritus? So you've got to come in and rake it, and then you've got to burn it, and so forth. So it's not just a simple one treatment situation. And you can see bladed, and during those early days, there wasn't many chemicals. 2,4-D came along after the World War II, and then in the early 50s, 2,4,5-T was developed, but it wasn't until later that this was used very much on our rangeland. You see some of these pictures from the 50s and 60s, from the grubbing hoe to the root plow to rakes and stinger blades and roller choppers and so on. And we don't see this much anymore. Cost of metal and the cost of diesel has kind of phased us out of the heavy mechanical, but also changing paradigms on land use has taken us out of that. With the advent of commercialization of hunting and the importance of wildlife, we started taking a different view on brush and its need for and the requirements for various species, and also realize that there are benefits for livestock out there, and for the pasture itself. So we started thinking about management. And I don't know if any of you have ever planted brush, but this is part of a management concept. You got too little, try to increase it. If you got too much, you try to decrease it. And go through the various scenarios that we've talked about earlier as far as why. Um, so we're still in that time frame or that era, so to speak, the management era, and this is where art is mostly. I mean, management is mostly art, and we've got good science, and to manage it correctly, we've got to learn how to apply it correctly. So the management era. Some would say we're in a fourth era, and that of sculpting. And this to me is a form of management. It's a concept of how much you need and what proportions, and so you can really get sophisticated with GPS equipment as you see here, but or you can just have simple patches and patterns out on the land. So, Pete, I'm going to stop here and ask uh, just think about this, and then how many eras do you think, or does the audience think we've gone through? Okay, well let's see what we have, and still a couple of votes coming in. Okay, let's move on, and we mentioned the era, the chemical era came in after World War II, and with a few different herbicides developed during the war and then used commercially on the land afterwards. First of all, just using basal oil, diesel on the base of these plants, it's been around a long time. It was learned early on that just by pouring some distillate or lube oil or diesel on the base would do a number on many of our species. So oiling, can't really put a date on that, but it goes back through the late 20s, 30s, and on. 2,4-D was developed in 42 and 2,4,5-T in 47. These are growth stimulants, and you can see this list over time. Some are in use today in various capacities on various crops, and others have been replaced, and then others have really been condemned. Uh, we we found they are uh, long lasting, or they're very dangerous to use. But uh, what's interesting is we look at picloram, was developed and patented in 1960, and this is a major prickly pear and mixed brush herbicide. Clopyralid has come along in more recent years. It's Reclaim, and it's been around since '61. Tebuithiron is Spike, and it's come since '70. Roundups since '71, and so on. You can see this. Some of these have been around a long time, and many are being reformulated today and remixed and looked at in different crop situations. Aminopyralid uh, is very popular today. It's a major component of Sindero. Aminocyclopyrachlor is under labeling right now, and will be under Envora, under the trade name Envora, and hopefully that'll be coming along soon. Uh, Consequently, with our brush management efforts, we started looking really heavy at uh, what is the impact of our brush management efforts, whether it be mechanical or fire or chemical. And some major scientific work has been done over the years looking at this. A lot of the data I've produced so far come from the status of brush control um, on the Rio Grande Plain, and you can just see the deer-brush relationships. And again, we have this kind of information from over most of Texas, so uh, it helps us learn about some of these things that we didn't know about when we first started doing it. Uh, Unintended consequences of design. When you plow fence row to fence row and take out the brush complex that's there, when we did it, deer was not important. Then 20, 30 years later, deer is important. So we've learned something. So we don't want to do that fence row to fence row. Patterning is important, and leaving the proportions out there is important. And then literally on a renovation or a conversion basis from really thick brush in most of South Texas and many parts of Texas, we also had to plant something afterwards. So in many cases, we had a concurrent uh, research effort and management effort in buffalo grass and cline grass and the old world blue stems, which in many cases today were not necessarily desirable. Back at the time it is, and for many people today it is desirable. But for many people it's obviously not. Uh, Size, and then we'll be talking about um, selective control, and in many cases we change from a mixed brush situation to a weed-satch situation or even a prickly pear situation. So shape also plays a big role, and again we have to think about the context of the time and whether it's long and narrow or thousands of acres. We uh, have changed our landscape to some extent. And then early on too, it was fence row to fence row. And they took out everything that was out there. And then as we learn more about it, we know shade is really, really important, especially when the soil surface in August may reach 140 degrees and out in the open, and it may be 90 something or even in the 80s underneath that mesquite tree. So just from a shade standpoint, just taking it all out had unintended consequences on the health and productivity of your beef herd. One of the main things we didn't know about, or if we did, we ignored, was that 98, 99% of the brush species in Texas resprout from a crown. And the chaining we've visited about just a few minutes ago, do not take out that crown. The root plow tries to, but it doesn't do a very good job of it. So by disturbing the soil and leaving that crown, next thing you know, you have, instead of a single stem plant, you have multiple stems. And within a few years, it's grown back to pre-treatment levels plus multiple stems. So you've got more of a mess than you originally had. Um, Seed banks are tremendous out on the pasture, and all it takes is a chance to grow and germinate and grow, that we'll have a thicket before of different species if we don't do something about it. So it became real apparent really quick that eradication was not feasible. If you're in prickly pear country, we know that just by running a drag over your prickly pear and spreading the pads or bits of pads, every one of those bits and parts have the capacity to root and grow, and you can change a really minimal situation with pear to a pear flat and a pear pasture in a hurry. Uh, in the eastern part of the state, if you look at disturbed soil in particular, weesatch becomes a real problem. So weesatch invasions and reinvasions have become, among other plants, obviously, that a a response to some of these brush manipulation practices that we have applied in years past. Pardon me. In many cases, we looked at one size fit all. Unintended consequences uh, in the parts of Texas with caliche outcroppings or rocky type soils, uh, trying to put a root plow through that in the early days brought up big chunks of hard material or even very cloddy material, and so, or like up in the hill country, you brought a lot of stone to the surface, and it so by disturbing the soil, we can either disturb the physical material, or in the case of say saline uh, levels in the soil, moving that around, changing the chemistry to some extent. Tools used pretty much ties back into what we've been talking about, whether it be resprouting, if you're just simply top removing a community of brush, then we've got a thicket in the making. Or if you've got prickly pear and you're using a drag, or brush hogging situation. So the tools have to be matched to the characteristics of what you're doing, and in many cases, historically, we haven't really bothered about that. This list of unintended consequences for fire is literally the list of pros and cons of using fire. So depending upon where you're at and under your specific circumstances, if you got sensitive receptors downwind, smoke is a major issue. You certainly want to keep it where you've put it, so escapes are a consequence. Timing, um, summer fires are uh, important from a weed control or a vegetation species control situation. But even summer fires do not change the temperature at all 2 inches down, and the bud zones of these plants are 8 inches down. So a hot summer fire isn't going to help you much more than a cool winter fire is. So these are some of the things that we've tried to do unsuccessfully. Fire whorls, especially near the edge, is an interesting phenomenon. If it lays down, it's an escape, and the pucker factor is pretty high when these things happen. And then, of course, many of us today are on the urban-rural interface, and with houses with other receptors in the neighborhood, we've got some, well, not some, we've got a lot of restrictions on the use of fire. And then, of course, reinvasion. We can do a good job on many species. For example, in the Cotulla area in LaSalle County, major species of blackbrush and mesquite overstory and the prickly pear understory. Depending upon what we used, we did a good job on mesquite, a decent job on the blackbrush, did not touch the prickly pear. 3 years later, we had a prickly pear thicket out there. And so then we have to come back and do something about the pear. So again, you need to know the capabilities and limitations of your tools. And this ties into what we've got on the slide now, selective responses, especially if you've got a mixture of species out there. It's not quite as complicated if you've got a pure stand or say a straight huisach, a straight mesquite, straight juniper, straight pear, something like that. Many of our chemicals have, again, pros and cons of use, and the labeling process tries to take out the risks and make sure we know how to use it. And we still have residues in persistence, which is a plus if you need some longer term control. Glyphosate's excellent. It's very quick, takes care of things right now, but as soon as those plants die and the new crop germinates, um, nothing's there to stop that from happening. So some kind of residual effect may be important to you, but it can be a problem elsewhere. Toxicology, all of these rangeland and pasture labeled herbicides are toxicologically safe for mammals and fish and birds. But just like anything else, you don't want to be exposed to it and breathe it and get it all over you and so on. So, common sense should prevail. Our biggest problem, our biggest problem is that of drift. And we may be limited in using some of these, particularly sometimes a year in certain counties, because of susceptible crops. We may be limited in use because of the urban interface and homes and gardens and the proximity. Um, and so aerial application of herbicides may be out. In fact, even ground application may be out. And some kind of a wipe on or some kind of individual plant treatment may be the way to go. But it's certainly a major consideration. From a non-target species standpoint, again, mesquite may be your major target, but at the same time, there may be some good deer groceries or other plants in there that you don't want to take care of. Certainly don't want to spray that 300-year-old oak and take it out. So you've got to really think in terms of how best to get it on that pasture without hurting non-target species. Forb shock is just the physical uh, act of spraying a pasture, killing the forbs, um, and depending upon what you put out and how much and timing and all, and how much of a seed source is there,
Yeah,
how
you had a
soon will it
question
come back?
earlier on the one slide that
So
talked about unintended
if there
consequences of
is
design and
a
application. Were you talking about the?
consideration for
There's three
forbs,
pictures on there, and the
then
question was from
you
Alan.
may
Says
not
were
want to
all the
do the whole
pictures out of
thing.
the same
You
same
may
place?
choose the herbicide that will do the least amount of damage to the forbs. And so again, art uh, mitigates the effects of some of these. Pete,
Yes,
we're
it's
going
the
to
one
look again
with the shapes we have on the
yeah,
bottom left. You have
at a
one,
question
two,
or
kind of open
two and
pasture,
then
and
ask
then
how
arrow
many
picture on the
major
right, and then
categories
on
of
the upper
brush
right, kind of like a
management
sendero.
methods are there?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he says Parsons Ranch, so I don't know if that's.
no, no. Uh, these photographs are now. Uh, I'll have to go back. Is that the one with the open pasture? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. No, no. Those weren't all on the same place, and they were over time as well. Hmm. No, those many of those were taken. Uh, some of the earlier ones on size was taken in the 50s and 60s, uh, and Rio Grande City and a few other places. Okay, looking at the answers again, there are four major categories of brush management, and we can look at mechanical, chemical, biological, and fire. And if you wish, we can add a fifth and just say a systems approach, because based upon our discussion so far and your
Yeah, Kathy has a
expertise and
question.
experience,
Her question
uh,
is, if you
we
spray
know that
pear and
not
mesquite by
one
IPT
species
in the
or
middle of
one
1,000 acres,
management
do you really need to worry
technique
about drift,
is going
or
to
does the wind
be
just make you spray less,
as effective
precise, and
as
effective?
combining these in some way. And looking over a planning horizon of 15 to 20 years, whatever you choose for an initial treatment, we know we're going to have to come back in 4 or 5 and maintain it somehow. And so we can combine these four major categories into that management system approach. All right. Oh, probably the latter. If you probably wouldn't want to get out and spray under any conditions when it's over 10, just from a precision standpoint, 10 miles per hour. And then if you're in the middle of 1,000 acres uh, and you've got a tractor or you've got an
Chris makes
airplane,
comment, the whole point of
uh,
IPT is to reduce
you're not
drift compared to
really going
broadcast
high
treatments.
risk of drifting, but you don't want to spray with a higher wind between say 10 miles an hour, or 4 to 12, something like that. And you want a little bit so that it'll help deposit it, but you don't want it so much that it goes off target. And especially, if you're doing an IPT, and you can direct that pretty close, but even so, it's still, you're wasting a lot if it's blowing away from you. No, the whole point of IPT is to give a situation like if you've got less than 300 plants per acre, an economic boost of just treating those plants and not wasting a bunch in between. But then again, the efficacy of IPT it normally is higher than a broadcast treatment at 20 gallons per acre, or even airly at 4 to 5 gallons per acre. You're concentrating your herbicide mix on the plant itself. So there are several reasons for using IPT. Okay, I'm going to summarize here and kind of go through some other uh, scenarios, I guess. And so today we're looking at the from a management perspective, uh, a multiple choice of why we want to do it. We've got lots of goals. We've got lots of situations where if we've got a hay meadow, we want to get rid of as much as we can for as long as we can. If we got wildlife habitat, then we want to leave enough for our the animals we're interested in, and then from an aesthetic standpoint and a recreation standpoint, all of these things are important. So how do we put this all in together? A couple of let's just call them facts. Brush is a key habitat component. It's part of the cover complex and the habitat, and it's part of the food complex and living space as well. And many people will say, man, my pasture's thick. It's really good deer habitat. Well, you may have a lot of deer in there, but it may be too thick to provide some of these other habitat components, like food and a place for fawning and so on. So yeah, it may be good escape, but you may want to consider thinning it down in areas so that you can improve the entire spectrum. And then if you've got cattle, you certainly don't want it completely covered up with brush. So vast, dense brush stands are not good habitat, and you want to try to do something about it. Um, Brush management can be a good tool. However, in the past, it was a good tool to convert big pastures to grass pastures. It for other reasons, it wasn't a good tool. And the one that meets the technology that meets your objective certainly is a major consideration as well. Clearing intensity is a key point. How much do you want to open up? The pasture here is on the lower right is a sandy type site, a sandy soil. It's a blue stem savanna with mesquite and mesquite mott's interspersed. Um, what they've done is kind of cut senderos through it. They burn it in patches. They do what they can on some of those patches for the brush. And so they're making it into a mosaic out there that gives uh, within short distances, the animals' ability to change and find what they need, and making more, I won't say 100% use of the habitat, but at least a greater intensity of the habitat. The mentioned food cover living space, edge is important. Edge between an open space of forbs and grass versus open space versus thick brush or more or less open brush, and how these fit together. And that's what that fancy name or fancy word juxtaposition means, how it all fits together. It's a jigsaw puzzle, and part of the art of applying this. Uh, Here are some of the guidelines that are in use if we're looking at a brush stand for white-tailed deer, pretty much all over Texas. Um, we don't need large areas of openings. We don't need large areas of brush, but irregular, fairly small, 20-acre blocks. Um, and so if we write a prescription for white-tailed deer habitat, we kind of think in terms of how all this should look on the land. And just putting a roller chopper or a root plow out there and going from one end to the other certainly is not the best way to do it. Quail is much the same way. Quail will get into thick brush. Uh, it's not that they don't like it. The hunters and the dogs don't like it very much. They can live, depending upon the configuration and the architecture of the brush, from anywhere from 5 to 15% brush cover. But it's got to be where they need it when they need it, all year round. So think about uh, every aspect of this when you consider a brush management program. Um, Several factors influence responses, both from cattle and wildlife. And this may be the site that you do it on. How does a saline clay flat site respond? How would a rocky hill site respond? And then, of course, the whole continuum down to a river bottom site. You need to think in terms of post treatment responses on the part of the vegetation. And then, of course, how you treat it afterwards becomes important. And if cattle are important, and they still are to many people, uh, growing grass, keeping competition in place so that you don't have as quick and as uh, dramatic a regrowth of the brush, or at least keeping the seed source from germinating and reestablishing. So grazing management really is important afterwards. So brush management is a lot more than just choosing a tool and uh, spraying it or treating it in some way. So you got to have complementarity of goals. They all got to fit together, and uh, the goals may be different on a hay meadow, obviously, that you don't want any brush on. On the other hand, you may need a thicket for escape cover, and then you got to think about trade-offs, clearing intensity scale, and consider your thresholds. How much can you take without harming a population, and how much do you leave so that you maintain your population? And you can look at the series of slides on this page taken over time and in many different areas, and some of the things that become interesting as we try to use herbicides or mechanical treatments, how much to take off, what kind of grass response do we have, how much cattle can take after that. Just running a fire guard through a pasture on sandy soils will result in crotons, for example, and more edge, more juxtaposition. So the landscape out here is your canvas. You are the artist, and everything we've been talking about are the paints. And you got to take every one of those and put it together to make that kind of art that you want and that will last you.
Yes, sir.
Remember
Kathy
though,
asked, can we get the
you put a
slides
root
for
plow
the
in the
deer and
ground
quail habitat?
and take out everything from pasture to pasture.
Yes, sir.
The complex is gone, the mesquite comes back, and it will never be the same in our lifetime. So, as Dale Rollins likes to say, you got to measure everything twice before you get to saw out and saw it once. That really completes what I have here. I'll be glad to try to answer any questions. And
Yes, they contact me.
Pete, if
I'll be
you'll
glad to send
moderate
them.
that, I'd
Yes, and
appreciate
a
it.
question kind of came in the background, or got kind of a comment from chat. From Chad, it says, "I would be hesitant to say that the vast amount of brush are
That's
not suitable
on here.
habitat generally. Some
Sure.
of the endangered species in
Yeah.
Texas, for
Yeah,
example, the ocelot, the jargondy,
they've been taking
uh,
like I said,
jaguargondy,
over South
Golden
Texas
warbler
for
depend on vast areas of brush.
over a period of time,
So
and
many
not
questions
only
to
South
range
Texas.
wildlife are answered
We
depends on your objectives."
they've come from all over the state in various places. So sure, um, contact me or Pete. Pete, you've got the PowerPoint now, and go ahead. Huh? Yep. Okay. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, exactly. Depending upon objectives, we have to take into consideration whatever the size and the shape and methodology and all of the factors that we've talked about today. And yes, if you're looking at a jaguarundi or an ocelot that needs dense native brush, uh, it's not so vast as it is connectivity. In so many cases today, our brush pastures and quails facing the same thing from a habitat standpoint is that
Yes, thank you.
they're not
I don't
connected.
see any other questions coming in,
They're
Dr.
been
Hanselka.
fragmented and broken
I
up
kind of popped out
into
a
situations
survey
where
question for
the
the
ocelot
audience,
has some trouble going
and I'll
from
put it here on the
one
chat pod
spot to the
as well
next.
so they can
On the
answer
other
it.
hand, you go up here for the
But
Atwater's prairie chicken,
the
and they do need large
again,
areas,
Dr. Hanselka, thanks for being
and
here today.
but they need
And
large
kind of,
areas of
I see some
almost
other
no
folks
brush at
typing the
all.
questions. So as they
So
type, let me
again,
say
your goals
our
and
next session will
objectives
be September the
and
3rd,
the
and
area you're
how to
in
manage
and
your
the
forage, and Dr.
species
Larry
you're
Whitman is going to be
aiming
here.
at certainly will
Again, you can
dictate on
follow us on
how
Facebook,
you go about doing it.
facebook.com/txrange. We put lots of information up there as well. And one is,
Anything
folks are
else?
here, one of the good things about this new software we're using is you can actually listen to us from the back 40 underneath the windmill or somewhere. We can actually, you can download a little app to your iPhone or your tablet or your Android, and you can actually listen to us as well from remote areas. So again, I don't see any more questions. Again, thank you all for coming today. Dr. Hanselka, thank you. If you're here for CEU credit, uh, please enter your email address in the chat pod so we'll have a record of it.